Hello, and welcome to our discussion today on sustainability and metrics. In this unit, Unit 2 in Issues in Sustainability, we're going to be delving into different ways to measure success of sustainability initiatives. We're going to take a look at how we traditionally measure success in a capitalistic society, and then we're going to compare and contrast that to potential metrics that really are focused on sustainability success and what that means. And is there a better scenario that can unfold when we rely on metrics that really dig in and extract performance on different levels other than just purely economic success? So I've entitled this lecture New Ways to Define Prosperity, Economic Growth, and Development. And the first thing that I think that we need to do is take a look at the difference between economic growth and economic development, and really identify what it is that we want to measure. Sorry, I didn't have my screen up there. So let's just pop back here. So this is the title of the discussion today. Here's what we're going to do first, is talk about this quantification. So economic growth is just a purely statistical, quantifiable trajectory of increase in goods and services produced by an economy. It doesn't speak at all to what those goods and services are and what sort of wider impact they may have on the well-being of constituents of any given country. So whereas development, the term development very distinctly talks about the well-being of inhabitants, and that how the economic wealth that's being generated, or that quantifiable statistic increase in goods and services, how those are contributing to the standard of living and the well-being of the folks that inhabit that city or county or state or country. So I'd like you to just take a moment, and you can even jot it down, and think about when you flick on the news or go onto your, go into digital media, what are we told, or what is released, what kind of data is released that speaks to our capitalistic success? So what do you see on the daily news or the quarterly news or the monthly news that reports to us as to our economic success in this country? So I'm just going to give you a couple seconds to think about that. So when I pose this question to myself, I just quickly jotted down 4 different data points that for me supposedly indicate where we are economically. One is GDP, the gross domestic product. And we'll define that in just a moment and talk about how that's something that politicians and economists and economic development specialists rely on quite significantly to indicate how well we're doing economically. You might have also jotted down employment stats, right? So either unemployment numbers as a percentage of folks actively seeking work, or conversely, how many people, what percentage are employed, right? What about housing starts, right? We see that. We see manufacturing jobs extracted. Of course, all of us watch the stock market on a daily basis. And, if there was ever a disjoined reality between where we are as far as the well-being of our citizenry and the value that the stock market holds right now, I mean, I can't in my lifetime honestly think of such a disparity between those 2 data points. So our current measurements, and I'm sure you probably have, quite a few others, there are many indicators that we use to determine traditional capitalistic success. So GDP, as I said, is one of the primary indicators. It's used by economists, and it takes the dollar value, excuse me, of all goods and services produced. And then it backs out things like consumer spending, consumer investment, and government spending. And then it adds in the net value of exports, which is what do we export minus what do we import. And it's always expressed as a percentage shift from the prior period. So, it's up 2% from last month, or it's down, 0.8% from last quarter. So, generally we consider that if GDP is going up, that's indicative that our capitalistic society is performing well. So, is that true? So the GDP metric was actually introduced as a measurement of capitalistic success in the 40s by a gentleman named Simon Kuznets, who was a Nobel laureate. And it was incredibly important in the 1940s. Bretton Woods, if any of you have heard of that, was a confluence of major economic players around the world, sort of on the eve of the treatise that ended World War II. And the major economic players came together and said, how do we prevent or preclude, we've had 2 world wars in 2.5 decades. How do we preclude this from happening again? And the general consensus was that if we were economic partners and reliant on each other financially and economically, that we wouldn't go to war with each other. And so this metric of GDP was developed to measure employment and development and income worldwide. And we, the players that were at the table at Bretton Woods, sort of collectively agreed that this was the metric that we would rely on to determine whether or not our policies were working. The problem with pure economic development as a measurement of success is that it in no way recognizes anything other than numbers on a piece of paper. It does not recognize social degradation. It doesn't recognize depletion of natural resources, or lack of clean water or carbon emissions, or any of the things that we're now seeing as a very negative precepts of just unbridled economic growth. So this was in 2015. And it's just talking about how the service economy has really become a huge contributor to the GDP, and how that is a measurement of growth. I mean, it's included as a measurement of growth. Services economy is, of course, included in GDP metrics, but how the service economy is really one of the major contributors to this disparity in wealth and this consolidation of actual physical tangible wealth in the hands of a few. So again, this is another sort of fallout from completely relying on GDP as a measurement of success. So yes, there's many more service jobs, but on a global scale, these are not oftentimes living wage jobs. So the question is, why do, the query is, why do we question it? And the answer is, it does not distinguish between costs and benefits, because, we've been traditionally told, money's being spent, GDP is being generated, therefore everybody's better off, right? And that's, the whole theory behind trickle down, right? So that if we cut taxes on the wealthy, they're going to have more money, they're going to create more jobs, that's going to trickle down, create GDP, everybody's going to be better off, right? So this was, well, it wasn't actually Reagan's original theory, but he was the first one to implement it politically on a widespread level. And we really have seen that not only does that add to our deficit, our trade deficit, not our trade deficit, I'm sorry, our national financial deficit, but it really didn't trickle down and yield direct economic benefit. So even the gentleman who designed GDP as a metric, Simon Kuznets, said, you know, the welfare of a nation can scarcely be inferred from a measurement of national income. The goals for more growth needs to specify what kind of growth and for what purposes. So just this endless growth of consumption, as we know now, generates untenable amounts of waste and depletes our natural resources at a rate that really is not something that we can sustain. So he spoke to the fact that there is no distinction between desirable or undesirable tenets when we're looking at GDP as a metric. So it basically, you know, so you smoke and then you need Nicorette. Both of those sales of those products go in to GDP, and the cost of caring for people with lung cancer goes into GDP. And those are all measured as positive things because they've contributed to GDP. So that's one of the things we're going to look at. That's, you know, obviously a pretty big problem for metrics of well-being. And then the same, on the same vein, it doesn't recognize all of the things that contribute to well-being, human well-being, but that are not encapsulated with the financial transactions or the trade of money. So what I'd like to propose and have you just have a think about are some other kinds of economic metrics, or other kinds of metrics that encapsulate economics, but also add some other levels or other tangential areas to the metric to make it a fuller and wholer measurement. So in, oh my gosh, I don't know exactly what year it was, probably late 80s, a gentleman named John Elkington proposed the metric of triple bottom line. And that's one thing you're going to hear me talk about a whole bunch in this class. And lots of businesses are now incorporating this idea of looking at wealth enhancement or well-being or success or, you know, performance evaluation through this sort of tripartite lens or through three areas. And we call it the 3 Ps or the 3 Es. People, planet, and profit. That's the 3 Ps. Or economics, environment, and equity. And economics is used with, you know, as another word for profit. People and equity are synonymous, and of course, planet and environment. So most people find the 3 Ps easier to remember, right? So if I'm instituting sustainability initiatives in Missoula County or Apple Computer or the country of Denmark, how am I measuring my success? And I've got to come up with metrics that measure the impact on people, the impact on the planet, and of course, the impact on profit, because without generating positive cash flow, the other two are sort of a moot point. So these are just, I'm not going to go through all of these certainly, but this is this whole idea of triple bottom line. How do we move past purely GDP and to some composite of other metrics that will speak to this, you know, wide swath of performance assessment. So the question is, do we start with GDP, or in the case of a business, you know, bottom line profit, net income, and then do we adjust that, or do we throw the whole thing out and say, hey, let's just start over and come up with a new set of metrics? Or do we go to some subjective measurements, which are of course qualitative in nature? Or is the best approach to take some, you know, a wide array of indicators and then weight them and make some sort of composite? So there's lots of potential approaches. We're going to be talking, let me see over here. And we're going to be talking today a little bit about something called genuine progress indicator. I had you do a reading on GPI. These are also some very socially based indices. The Human Development Index, we're going to do some reading on that. Each of you are going to take the ecological footprint and do some a reflection piece on that in the discussion forum. The Happy Planet Index is, I'd like to just say that, is a measurement tool that looks at how well GDP, what's the change in GDP from quarter to quarter, but as it pertains to your footprint. In other words, it's a comparative metric. So how is your GDP performing based upon how many resources you use? So you can't just be, mindlessly destroying, swaths of productive agricultural land to build factories, because that's not going to be, in the best interest environmentally. So it's a comparative index. So supplementing GDP, the only one I think we're going to talk about, just trying to read these quickly, is sustainable development indicators, SDGs and SDIs. So we will be looking at those as well. So whenever we look at this big pot of metrics that are intended to measure economic development or sustainable development, they are generally what are called ratio-based or comparative numbers. So we're measuring success, financial success, but as they pertain to social and environmental impacts. So if we're comparing something, for example, to environmental or economic success to labor stats, there's going to be a differentiation between, for example, kids picking cotton in Uzbekistan when they should be in school are going to contribute to cheap t-shirts at the Gap, versus somebody that's paid a living wage to harvest cotton. That wage differential is going to be incorporated in the metric. So again, this is really tough, how you add social well-being into an equation, because oftentimes sometimes it's quantifiable, like the example I just gave with the wage base, but it's oftentimes really amorphous, like how is the overall well-being of the employees measured? Are they able to pursue a healthy lifestyle? What's their work-lifestyle balance? In this country, we have tons and tons of safety nets in place, but when you get to places like, Bangladesh or Pakistan or Algeria or China, it gets a lot murkier as to the ability for employees to also live healthy lifestyles. So the question is, and hopefully you'll be seeing some different examples, is how are these areas incorporated into the metrics, right? So how do we measure the healthcare inputs that go into manufacturing that t-shirt? Well, we can run metrics as to what percentage of labor costs are attributable to employee benefits, right? To healthcare, to retirement, to access to mental health benefits and things like that. So one of the queries is, of course, always, is now the time? Should we be doing this now? So, and I love this quote is, what you measure is what you get. So what that means is if you're not actively accruing statistics or quantifying results, then it's really difficult to say whether you're being successful at it. And also, especially in large corporations, it's really hard to target programs or to put dollars towards improving areas of a business if you're not measuring it. So, for example, saying, we want to minimize our water usage in our organization, but you're not taking your water footprint. You don't have a baseline. You're not measuring how your current initiatives are leading you to progress down that road. At the end of the day, how can you say whether you decrease your water usage in any meaningful way? So you've got to put metrics. You've got to measure what it is that you're trying to improve or change. New Zealand's got a really progressive prime minister. I'm sure you've heard about her, as pertains to things like climate change and gun control. And she's looking at incorporating well-being in their national budget. How do we measure that? The World Bank now uses, one of their metrics is comprehensive wealth. So it's this sense of wealth that incorporates more than just salary and financial well-being. So there's a metric called GPI. I think I had you do a reading on it. I don't remember exactly which one it was offhand. We've got a lot of readings and I've got a lot of classes. So at any rate, but I know that I had you read about this. This is one of my personal favorites. So GPI takes GDP and then adjusts it, right? So it says, let's talk about what we value as a society, and that will help drive policy agendas and economic agendas and environmental agendas. And let's assign explicit value to add and subtract to the baseline measurement of GDP. So things like, let's put quantifiable amounts to environmental quality, or attaining high levels of education, or the security of livelihood, or what do we do with our free time. This is actually a really good YouTube video on this. And let's take those values and adjust GDP and come to a new indicator that we will utilize at the federal and state governmental levels. So for example, and I use the example of smoking. These are all, quite similar to that. So GDP takes all the expenses of crime and family breakdown, right? I mean, divorce attorneys and security systems and private prisons and all the ancillary services that feed into our private prisons and jails and pre-release centers. Those are all added into GDP, right? Because they're economic generators. GPI subtracts those costs because those are not part of a positive well-being. So all of the transactions that occur outside of our financial, of our normal financial system, that doesn't make its way into GDP at all because money doesn't trade hands. But what about all the women and men that are engaged in childcare and elder care and household work and volunteer work and all faith communities and all the things that make our communities richer and more robust? Those aren't included in GDP at all. So GPI would actually add the value of those of that work at fair market value into the calculation. And same with all these kinds of things, pollution, right? So GDP often you'll see polluting, polluting industries, obviously, strip mining or mountaintop mining or, degradation due to fossil fuel extraction. Those are all, of course, included, as in their original baseline endeavors. Those are included in GDP, but then we see it again when it's being cleaned up. So oftentimes you'll see pollution is actually, the effects of polluting industries are actually included twice. So GPI pulls out those costs. This basically all says that. So, and then as our work weeks and, the bringing home, you know, technology, how we've got our work in front of us 24/7, the loss of leisure time. So GDP doesn't recognize that at all. GPI says, you know, that's actually is something of value, the time that we have in our communities and with our families. Defense expenditures, right? All the guns and the ammo and the protective services that we need around that. GPI subtracts those from the measurement. So you can see, this is an old chart, but if GPI is measured pretty status quo when we measure GDP, of course, it looks like, wow, our policies and our initiatives and, you know, the direction that we're going as far as trying to promote, you know, tax change and policy changes are successful. Whereas, you know, really, when you look at GPI, we've stayed quite stagnant. So just kind of in wrapping up, I'm not going to talk in a ton of depth about this because you've got some readings to do. But every year, the United Nations puts out a human development index or a human development report, and it looks at by country. It looks by country at really just a wide swath of metrics that measure things like gender and equality, attainment of education, access to justice systems, access to capital, access to markets, freedom of speech and religion. It looks at, you know, as well as, you know, purely economic measurements. And it makes a composite or a compilation of how well the people in that country, what their stature as far as well-being is. And we're going to do a discussion forum looking at the most recent stats around this distributive justice through HDI in next week, I believe. Happy Planet Index. Again, this is this how economically well is a country doing per unit of ecological input. So, and it's quite interesting. Actually, I think this is last year's report. I'm not sure where we fall this year. You might take a peek at it, but almost all, well, as far as I've been following this, it's always either Costa Rica or one of the Scandinavian countries always have this sort of metric of GDP and per ecological input. So I hope this has given you some fodder for thought, and that you're enjoying your readings, that you're ready to dig into your discussion forums. If you have anything that you want to discuss one-on-one, please feel free to just email me or throw it in the discussion forum, and have fun thinking and reading and writing about these topics. Okay, take care.